Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. So let's talk about Axios and the Axios acquisition. So Axios is a bit of an inspiration for our site, Near Media, a little bit. We're not modeled on it, but we use sort of the bulleted style that they use a little bit. I think Axios is a really pretty good site. They do a pretty good job. The format that they use is really ill-suited for analysis pieces or longer pieces, which they try and sort of jam stuff that should be just allowed to kind of roam free into this kind of structure. But it works pretty well. Nonetheless, Cox Enterprises bought them for $525 million, or they agreed to be sold for $525 million. Cox started out in the newspaper business. They still own one newspaper, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, but they sold their newspaper, TV, and other local media, radio, TV, newspapers to the Apollo Group in 2019, which also owns Yahoo. And Cox sort of transitioned into being a kind of a digital first company with Auto Trader, Kelley Blue Book, and they have, and then they're also a big cable company and ISP. So, according to the report that I saw, which was Axios itself, the main reason for the deal was Cox's interest in building out Axios Local, which is their local news initiative that I think is now in about 22 cities, and they plan to expand the coverage, and that will presumably flow from this. And it's great that they want to build out what they called local watchdog journalism. So it's not simply about exploiting some sort of local opportunity, but it's really trying to be journalistic and perform the role that newspapers have historically performed. The problem is, from my point of view, is that it's pretty limited. It's better than nothing, but it's like 5 stories written by one person. Maybe they have a second person. And it's really not a replacement for what used to be kind of pretty complete local coverage from newspapers. Now most of the local coverage is coming from TV, which is much weaker and very different. And newspapers, for the most part, with some exceptions, are quietly or not so quietly disappearing and creating these so-called news deserts, where there's just no local coverage at all.
Well, I also applaud the at least the effort to extend a somewhat quality news organization into local markets. I think that's something we should all be rooting for. I would say my own experience as a news consumer in Portland is that the most successful investigative journalism has really been done by our alternative news weeklies. In our case, Willamette Week is a really well-known version of this. Portland Tribune also comes out with a handful of interesting stories from time to time. And I don't believe Axios Local is available in Portland yet, but I wanted to try it out, and I signed up in Denver when they first announced the first set of locations that they were providing this. And it is interesting to me that the daily newsletters that you get every morning are much closer in style to the Willamette Week newsletter than something like a Wall Street Journal or Washington Post newsletter. I think that they are what's the word I'm looking for? They're sort of intentionally sort of mimicking the alt weekly style as a means to maybe connect with a little bit younger audience, et cetera, et cetera. I think that what would I say, Greg? There is a sort of quasi down the middle paper in Portland, which is the Oregonian, owned by Advanced Local. And they actually stripped back their print coverage to 4 days a week. And now most of the stuff that they produce is actually behind a paywall. And I actually think in Portland anyway, there is a real opportunity for a more or less down the middle media outlet that doesn't restrict things by paywall. I think I've been increasingly frustrated as a reader of the Willamette Week that it's just any kind of any kind of politically tinged story is like just slathered in blue paint on the Willamette Week. And so I think that there is an opportunity for a much more sort of centrist position in in Portland's local media scene. And I have a feeling that's true in other markets where even if there is a very strong, alt weekly that publishes very good investigative journalism on a consistent basis, that there's still an opportunity for something that's more akin to the historical newspapers that have sort of died off.
Go ahead, Mike.
One is Axios is down the center, at least on their main site, has been less than fulfilling to me on stories that I know about. For example, they wrote about Google leveraging their position with small businesses to try to influence government policy vis-a-vis antitrust. And it was the lamest article one could imagine, and somehow left it like this is just two sides of a story with no critical analysis. So that was, to me, disappointing. So if that's what centrist means, I don't need it.
What aboutism? Both sidesism?
Yeah, whatever it's called. The other question I have, though, is what's going to happen to the main Axios sort of national presence? Is that it's not being, that's being packaged up and sold at Cox as well, though, right?
Yeah, the whole thing is being sold. What the founder said is that they're sticking around. It's all going to continue in the same way. They're just going to build things out more. So this
founders always say that, and then a year in they realize
two, depending on what they
signed,
what the
life
agreement
sucks,
is.
so.
Yeah. Well, I'm not even talking about ideologically. I think that's an interesting issue, but the arts coverage, local business, there's just a wide range of things about life in cities and towns that the newspaper captured and reflected back to people. And it was also a sort of one of the things I think that was significant culturally is that it was newspapers were a sort of a cohesion vehicle for places. Everybody would sort of see themselves mirrored through the coverage or the paper. And there was this kind of, it was like the local news back in the day when there were 3 networks and everybody watched, not local news, national news. And so that's what's really changed, is that just this kind of lack of cohesion, lack of coherence in whatever remains of local coverage. It's all very fragmented, which is a mirror of the national kind of polarization and fragmentation, with people sort of gravitating toward their own ideological buckets. And I think this is a good development, and let's see what they can do, and hopefully it'll be successful. But it's not.
I think it's, to me, this is the first time that a real news organization has even attempted something like this, where it's, I feel like earlier models like Patch was not a news company.
No, that was crowdsourcing.
Precursor to Nextdoor more than it was a news, local news experience. And every other experiment in local news seems to have been tried by a company who was still tied in some way to print. And so I think that to have Axios does, as far as I know, doesn't have a print publication at all.
No.
And so to have someone who is only digital, who understands the news business, who understands how to source good journalists, who understands how to edit stories, I think is a really, I don't know if I'm optimistic, but I'm eager to see what they can do with a real sort of, digital first infrastructure behind them across multiple markets.
Well, the business model has always been the issue, right? As advertising is drained out of the local media market or substantially and gone to sort of big networks, it's been very hard. You've got sort of a nonprofit model, which I guess is working in isolated places to some degree with a skeleton crew. You've got some kind of subsidy with an existing publication, subscription, and it's nothing has really worked. So that'll be the interesting thing here.
Do you think Apple's play to limit third-party data is encouraging these sort of first-party efforts and could be leveraged in the news world as assuming it's national? In other words, they get 75 local markets.
Yes.
They then could create a first-party advertising network that would be successful.
Yes, I suspect that's part of the vision. I mean, there was an interesting article that I saw. I don't remember which publication, but it was comparing the fortunes of the New York Times, which is expanding its advertising and Gannett, which is the largest newspaper publisher, formerly Gatehouse Gannett, that you were a part of, David, is the largest newspaper publisher. And Gannett's sort of economics are creating challenges. New York Times is seemingly thriving, and Gannett is not.
Well, one of the challenges for Gannett is that they have a very large interest payment to private equity.
Well, that's
subsidized a huge part of the merger. So
that's a big issue, but that's kind of outside of the scope of this discussion. But thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.